opportunity just to chat a little bit more with community members, and also we get a secondary benefit of we've onboarded a lot of interns and new staff recently, so this doubles as a kind of history of the last 4 years of climate action in Portland, and something that it's a good teaching tool for them as we move into our campaign season this summer. So me and I today, we're going to talk about what we see as a collective, maybe beginnings of a transition plan in Portland away from fossil fuel infrastructure. It's something that, looking back, has some kind of coherence to it now, but in fact was a lot of different campaigns that were sort of pieced together over time. But what we might now call the Portland Program for Climate Action is something that was hard-won through struggle, and is something now that's being borrowed from in other parts of the country. So for example, just within the last couple of years, 350.org's national campaign was aligned strongly with what happened in Portland over the last 3 years, or last 5 years, you'll see what I mean soon. So I think me and I actually met and got involved with this work through fossil fuel infrastructure opposition. And what that means to us and why that was relevant in the Pacific Northwest is that in around 2013 or 2014, we started seeing this uptick of fossil fuel export projects in the Pacific Northwest, and those were coal, oil, and gas terminals. And that coincided with a lot of extraction activities happening in the United States and Canada, and I would say a generalized transition in global energy economy where the United States started becoming a net exporter of fossil fuels rather than the traditional kind of like we're the big users in the world bloc. So Sightline Institute out of Seattle, I think in 2014, had a report that said at the time, if we added up the carbon content of all the fossil fuel export proposals at that point, which I think there were 28 of them at the time, if all of those were to be built and operated at full capacity, it would be at 5 times the amount of fossil fuels that would be moving through the Keystone XL pipeline. And the Keystone XL pipeline at that time was kind of the climate game over project, if that were to be completed and all that stuff moved. So 5 times the worst project in North America at that point. And we began to see this as a collective issue rather than seeing these as isolated and individual projects. We started to think regionally of how can we actually structure resistance. So our colleagues throughout the Pacific Northwest were engaged in resisting oil, coal and gas terminals, and then that work came to Portland. So just to clarify, and I want to also plug some of David's work here. David works in the building, he's an amazing resource. Their organization, Oil Change International, does a lot of data gathering and projection and recommendation on policy for the United States and internationally about how we can draw down carbon. So they've been a really amazing partner in thinking through the consequences of the amazing expansion of oil, coal, and gas extraction and shipping in the United States. So maybe he'll do a lunchtime talk for us sometime. So when we talk about fossil fuel infrastructure, we mean things like pipelines and coal terminals, and oil trains, and oil and gas storage tanks. There's more that you could expand that definition. Some people in our community also consider freeway expansion to be fossil fuel infrastructure, which is something that we would probably align with. But historically, when we started using that term, we meant this type of infrastructure.
And so Nick mentioned that there were all these regional proposals, and many people in Portland had gotten involved in the climate movement, fighting these proposals for coal, oil, and gas terminals throughout the region. And then in fall of 2014, a terminal was proposed in the city of Portland. It was proposed by a Canadian company called Pembina, and everyone got to have a lot of fun talking about the Pembina proposed propane terminal at the Port of Portland, and all of the hilarious P's. But that was a terminal that, when proposed, was sort of considered a done deal. The city was behind it. The mayor and the city council thought it was a great thing for Portland, even though they were self-proclaimed climate leaders. And the climate activist community and really a lot of smaller nonprofits got together to fight back against this terminal and to fight back against the narrative that there was such a thing as a safe fossil fuel or a bridge fuel, a fossil fuel that would help us, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And we really built this narrative saying, it's no coal, no oil, none gas, no fossil fuels. And when we defeated that terminal, there was a lot of energy and momentum in the city of Portland. And coincidentally, that summer was when Shell Oil was proposing and trying to do their exploratory drilling in the Arctic. And one of their boats, the Fennica, one of their icebreakers, actually hit an underground sea rock or an icebreaker or an iceberg on the way to the Arctic and had to come to Portland for repairs. And so community members got together and organized a blockade to actually prevent this boat from getting to the Arctic, with the goal that it would miss its very short season for drilling. And later that fall, Shell actually canceled their plans to drill in the Arctic, and they cited public opposition as one of the things that led them to move away from this project. So Portland had a lot of energy and a lot of momentum fighting these individual proposals, and we really worked hard to say, okay, we need a systematic policy, something to once and for all say no to all fossil fuels. At that same time, Portland was updating its climate action plan that's internationally recognized as one of the best climate action plans in the world. And we wrote a write-in campaign and successfully added in an action to direct the city to establish a fossil fuel policy that would consider things like life cycle emissions, safety, economics, etc., and that the city would oppose all coal and oil exports and transportation throughout the state. And of course, we continued to pressure the city. We wouldn't let them just have this ambition. And 6 months later, the city passed the first resolution in the country to comprehensively oppose fossil fuel infrastructure. And at the same time, the city also passed a resolution to comprehensively oppose oil train transport through Portland. And these were two really exciting resolutions. They had city council dates together, brought out hundreds of people to come to rallies and give testimony to talk about both the climate impacts of all fossil fuels and also to start to talk about the neighborhood and local health and safety impacts of fossil fuel infrastructure. So the city passed a resolution opposing oil trains and oil terminals, and then the city passed the first resolution in the United States to comprehensively say no to fossil fuel infrastructure. And since then, I think over a dozen other communities have passed similar resolutions. And as Nick mentioned, we've seen national organizations take on this campaign as something they want to see reproduced in other places.
Does that mean we have no exports allowed of fossil fuels from Portland?
So we'll get into the details of how it functionally operates in just a sec, but that's the aspiration is to get to that point. But sort of as we'll tell a little bit of the history, and then we'll get into some projects that are sort of skirting the intent of what we tried to do then and how we might impact that.
And so the resolution also called for implementation, and so it laid out directives for further policy. And one of those directives it called for was for the city to look at its zoning code and to change its zoning code to prohibit any new fossil fuel storage terminals. When they were doing that, they could not retroactively, say that the existing fossil fuel terminals could go away. They can only pass policies that look at new terminals. So the city passed an ordinance that did, in fact, change its zoning code to prohibit new fossil fuel terminals. So the city passed these amazing policies, these great resolutions, set out these directives, and then a fossil fuel disaster finds itself in Portland. June 3rd, 2016, an oil train traveling through the Columbia Gorge on the Oregon side derailed in Mosier, Oregon. I think 16 rail cars caught fire and exploded. Oil did leak into the Columbia River and into the ground at that time. There were luckily no fatalities from that oil train derailment, and the fire department in Mosier cited that it was a windless day and a normally very windy area, and they think that if the wind had been blowing that day, the school with children would have caught on fire from this derailment. And so we were really spared. We're really lucky that this terrible disaster wasn't even worse. And I think that was really another wake-up call and another sign to our elected officials that we need to be doing more to address the existing threats from fossil fuels.
So at the same time that we were passing resolutions, the city was updating its climate or its comprehensive plan, which happens every 20 years. And the comprehensive plan, well, back up. What you'll see around local strategy is that we're always in a position of disadvantage when we're dealing with the fossil fuel industry, because a lot of the fossil fuel industry is regulated at the federal government, and then the state level government also has some regulatory authority. And so in the area of regulation, local government always has the least amount of authority. So we have to be really creative in figuring out how we can best exercise our health and safety powers. So one way to do that in Oregon especially is through the comprehensive planning process and through the expression of zoning code. We have unique land use laws here that give cities quite a bit of authority there. So while we're changing our climate action plan, we also managed to get some directives into the new comprehensive plan. And the major policy is to limit fossil fuels distribution and storage facilities to those necessary to serve the regional market. It's unclear what the regional market actually would mean if this were to be tested, but it's pretty clear that doesn't mean export. So the city expressed in its comprehensive plan the desire to move away from fossil fuel exports. So all of those steps led to the first expression of this unanimous city policy to oppose fossil fuel infrastructure through what are called the fossil fuel terminal zoning amendments. So in 2016, right at the tail end of former Mayor Charlie Hale's tenure, they passed the fossil fuel terminal zoning amendments 5-0 unanimous vote. And what these do, it's a bit technical, but they create a new land use category called bulk fossil fuel terminals. And they say that we're not going to build any more of those. So what that means is facilities with over 2 million gallons of storage capacity. And if you've ever been out to the Northwest Industrial Area, Highway 30, you'll see all these huge tank farms all over the place. So we're not allowed to build any more of those that would be used for fossil fuel infrastructure. So it's basically capped that. It caps the size of existing terminals, so those that are either supplying transportation fuels for the local market or those that are currently exporting, such as the Zenith facility, can't increase storage capacity either. And this was the first time this had ever been attempted, and in a lot of state and federal law now, you'll actually see language from the Portland Code copied and pasted sort of in, so the definitions and terms that we've established here have become sort of standard industry or standard regulatory terms now, which is interesting because you get to watch how local action can kind of filter up and become more broadly applied. So it really does matter what you do at the local level. So we got sued right away by the fossil fuel industry as the city of Portland got sued. And because of the way that our land use rules work, the first stage of litigation had to take place in Oregon State Court at the Land Use Board of Appeals. The Land Use Board of Appeals is a 3-judge panel, and 2 of the judges had to recuse themselves for various conflicts of interest. We were left with 1 sitting administrative law judge to make a decision here. When the city was sued, the Center for Sustainable Economy, along with Columbia Riverkeeper, Portland Audubon, Oregon Physician for Social Responsibility, and Craig Law Center intervened to be a party to that lawsuit so that we could advance our own arguments during that legal process. And ultimately, it was a very bad process from the standpoint of environmental advocates. We lost on several issues. The code was overturned and importantly was found to have violated the Dormant Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which is a judicially created inversion of the regular Commerce Clause that says that Congress should have full authority over interstate commerce, basically. And the Dormant Commerce Clause says states are not allowed to discriminate against out-of-state commerce to benefit in-state users. So it came really quickly after we passed this code, and it was a huge deflation of that energy and momentum that we've been working on. But we appealed to the Oregon Court of Appeals and advanced arguments and basically said LUBA got it wrong. And they overturned many of the decisions that LUBA made in a positive way. They sustained some of the more technical land use pieces, but they overturned the big constitutional question And so the Oregon Court of Appeals said, well, there's actually no in-state fossil fuel exporters. There's no like Portland Oil Export Inc. or something like that. And so it's actually impossible to benefit in-state corporations over out-of-state fossil fuel exporters. It just can't possibly be. And they also said that the city has a legitimate interest in trying to mitigate harms of the fossil fuel industry, especially as it relates to seismic protections. So one thing we haven't mentioned yet, one of our strongest arguments for being able to regulate the fossil fuel industry is that we expect large earthquakes to happen in our region. And 95% of Oregon's fossil fuel infrastructure that serves transportation mostly is sitting on liquefaction zones, so formerly wetlands areas that were filled in 100 years ago, and that soil will liquefy, and all of those tanks, many of them, which have been updated since maybe the 70s at the latest, are going to rupture, slide into the water, potentially triggering mass catastrophe in that area. And there aren't great tools that have been previously available to get them to either seismically retrofit or dismantle that infrastructure. So the Oregon Court of Appeals basically said, yes, if you're trying to reduce the risk from the fossil fuel industry and the risks of seismic catastrophe, that's totally allowed. That's a legitimate interest. And absent some other kind of compelling reason to not do that, it doesn't matter if you're not solving the whole problem. If you're making progress on that problem, you're allowed to do it. Importantly, the Oregon Court of Appeals did not make a ruling over whether we're allowed to regulate on the fossil fuel industry on climate issues alone. So it's not clear whether Oregon courts would say, yes, local governments are allowed to regulate with climate, but health and safety is a power that's reserved to the city, and the Oregon Court of Appeals affirmed that.
Pretty soon after we worked on campaigning for policies to prohibit fossil fuels, community organizations started working on a campaign for the city and county to pass policies to transition to 100% renewable energy. And so looking at that both from a climate perspective, knowing that fossil fuels are contributing to climate change and therefore we need to rapidly transition away from them if we want to address climate change, but also looking at it just from an economic resiliency perspective and from the perspective of health and safety, that there aren't safe ways to store and transfer fossil fuels, but we don't have the same issues with a solar spill or things like that. Very excitedly, the city was really interested in this idea. They wanted to be able to be for something and saw that this was something that'd be really great, especially with the economic benefits from renewable energy. So the city and county did in fact pass resolutions calling for 100% renewable energy. At the time, they joined over 20 other cities that had passed similar policies, but a few things made Portland's policy distinct and unique. One was the timelines the policy was on. It calls for a complete transformation of our electricity to be 100% renewable by 2035, and then it calls for all sectors community-wide to meet all of our energy needs with renewable energy by 2050. So we set these two different dates to recognize that the electricity sector, our utilities, are able to make this transformation much quicker with existing technology, and that potentially for transportation sector, industrial polluters, things like that, need some more time, but we know that this is doable and that this is possible. At the same time that we were doing this, one of our local utility companies, Portland General Electric, actually had a proposal to build out 2 new natural gas plants at the Carty Generating Station that would have been predominantly supplying power to the city of Portland. And so very quickly we recognized that there were 2 paths for our energy future, one with renewable energy and the other with fracked gas. And within a few months, Portland General Electric decided to back away from their plans for these gas plants and to actually reshift and rework their 20-year energy plan to be more rooted in renewable energy and not in building new gas or fossil fuel infrastructure. And in a really interesting moment, I think for me as an outside advocate, was to see how the utilities tried to then champion renewable energy. And I think it was a moment of recognition, especially for Portland General Electric and Northwest Natural, where so much of their business is in Portland. Pacific Power, our other utility, they do operate in 5 other states, so Portland is a much smaller percentage of their market share. But for our other utilities, if the city of Portland and Multnomah County say, like, we're going to renewable energy, if you want business here, you also have to transition to renewable energy. We saw the utilities jump on board and say they wanted to champion that as a partner, and our utilities actually launched a series called Pathways to 100% Renewable, where they would engage in discussions with community members, experts, other government partners, looking at how are we going to make that transition. And that's, in general, I think, a question that is still ongoing and something that will be figured out over many decades. It was really, really exciting to see that because there had been this proposal for frac gas power plants, our 100% renewable energy resolution had an immediate impact by influencing the companies to not build those gas plants and not commit Portland to decades more of fossil fuel emissions and carbon emissions from those power plants. And now, kind of where we're sitting at today is Portland General Electric. They're updating their integrated resource plan. That's their 20-year energy plan they have to work on as part of state law. And we are seeing them following through or starting to follow through on this commitment to transition to renewable energy. And that's also a huge place that we need to be watchdogging that transition to make sure it's both happening and that renewable energy development is happening in a way that is just and equitable and really rooted in community resilience. And yeah, Nick, do you want to talk about the Clean Energy Fund?
Sure. So in 2018, I guess, there was a really interesting initiative that started from the grassroots up called the Portland Clean Energy Fund, and organizations largely representing communities of color, led by communities of color, like Opal Environmental Justice, Asian Pacific Islanders Network of Oregon, NEA, and others, created a steering committee and basically wrote their own resolution for what they wanted to see a just transition look like. And just transition is a term that generally means if we're going to be moving away from the fossil fuel industry, how do we do it in a way where communities that had previously not benefited from the fossil fuel economy or been sort of like the losers of the last economy, how do those communities actually get to benefit first from the transition? So a ballot initiative was crafted that would tax large retailers with over $1 billion in national sales, I think, 1% on their basically gross receipts, how many after sales and all the rest are calculated. And then that would create a fund somewhere between $50 and $80 million a year that would be managed by the city in order to train new members of a renewable energy workforce for energy efficiency installation, for subsidies for renewable energy installation, and many other worthwhile activities. And that went to the ballot in November of 2018 and passed overwhelmingly. Something like 65% of Portlanders voted for that. So that was an example. We talk a lot about sort of the Green New Deal is a phrase that's come very common lately, and a lot of folks locally and nationally, including Van Jones, see the Portland Clean Energy Fund as a really good example of a Green New Deal-like policy where we're seeing who has the resources in society, who's benefited the most, who can afford to pay their fair share, and what are the types of programs and policies that we want to advance in order to get there. So very, very exciting development, and presently it's still in the administrative phase. They're assessing and collecting their first year of revenue for the program. They're also hiring staff. They recently hired a man named Sam Barrasso out of the county who's really amazing to head this program in the city. And they're still hiring for staff and appointing board members. But starting 2020, you should see the first administration of this fund. Today, in fact, so there is a little bit of, let's say, corporate backlash to this. So WinCo has begun to kind of like protest, let's say, the Clean Energy Fund by putting a line item on your receipt if you go to WinCo that says 1% Clean Energy Fund, and actually like assessing that cost and explicitly passing it on to consumers. Kind of like a whiny, it's like a really like bizarre thing. So there's actually a protest happening in WinCo, I think, right now that's sort of saying this is a really childish practice out of WinCo. So Okay, so that's kind of a history, and to be honest, we could do like a 4-hour seminar on that. There's a lot of detail that's left out, and maybe in Q&A we can talk more about some of those details. But we wanted to get toward what CSE and SEEN are planning this summer, because there's a whole lot of stuff that's in line with a lot of that history that people can get involved with, and might take us to maybe even the next step. So the first piece doesn't even get its own slide, but those court cases that I was talking about, part of that, where we were left in that process, is that the city has to have its own supplemental process to reinstitute that fossil fuel infrastructure ban. So that's going to happen probably in July or August, and that should be, it's anticipated that it will be a pretty narrow process, because everybody's already agreed that this is good policy unanimously 2 or 3 times over. So we anticipate that the city will just make some findings and reinstitute its code. That's something that folks can easily get involved with, either by sending a letter to the city or working with us in terms of what advocacy that we're going to do. There's also, as of the new year, we have found that there's an existing oil terminal that's expanding our operations and has already and potentially will be bringing in more oil from the Canadian tar sands, which is the most polluting fossil fuel project on Earth right now. And so we have an active campaign to try to stop that terminal expansion and restrict that terminal's operation. And then there's also what's called fossil fuel risk bonds, which is a program to attempt to shift the costs of risks of fossil fuel infrastructure back onto the industrial polluters rather than having the public absorb that cost. So we'll kind of talk about those one by one.
So many people are not familiar with the fact that Portland actually has 11 fossil fuel terminals clustered together in Northwest Portland. And one of those terminals was purchased by a new owner at the end of 2017 called Zenith Energy. And this was a facility that many of us had kind of been spotting for many years as a facility that had some of the infrastructure components that would make it a potential for a large oil terminal. Specifically, that it is connected to a rail line and has rail access that the other facilities do not have. Historically, this was an asphalt terminal. It had a refinery component that shut down in 2006. And they stopped producing asphalt a few years after that. And the facility has also been permitted for crude oil. And I think from the perspective of regulators, crude oil and asphalt are very similar because they have very similar emissions profiles in terms of VOCs and local air contaminants. But from a zoomed out perspective, looking at life cycle emissions, looking at climate, looking at risks from oil trains, asphalt and crude oil are very, very different. So Zenith is a facility that can receive oil trains. It also has large storage tanks, and they are not connected to their own dock, but they have neighbors that they work closely with that we'll talk about. So like I said, this is a historic asphalt terminal. It's gone through many changes of ownership. Most recently, in December 2017, it was sold to Zenith Energy Management. Prior to that, not much had been happening at this facility. There's a great quote from a DEQ staff person that the Oregonian published who calls it a ghost town and a fixer-upper. This facility was not really doing much. And then Zenith buys it and pretty immediately starts bringing in Canadian tar sands trains. And within their first 6 months of ownership, Zenith was exporting tar sands crude by a marine tanker. This was something that had not been done before in Portland. So we started to get into this interesting category where we had an existing oil terminal. Nothing had changed at that time at the facility. And yet a new owner meant a new operation was starting to happen. And yet it fell within the air permitting and the broad categories of what was allowed back when this facility had been an asphalt terminal and refinery, which it had not been operating as for over 10 years. We also know that there is actually a history of spills and leaks and small releases from this facility itself, and that shouldn't be a surprise because with fossil fuels, it's not a question of if, but a question of when these things will happen. And then the picture is just from the Kalamazoo River, where there was a tar sands train derailment over 5 years ago, and they're still cleaning it up today. In about January of this year, we started to notice an unusual amount of activity happening at the Zenith facility. And it was then reported and confirmed that Zenith was actually actively expanding their rail unloading capacity. And that's where we started to figure out that our policy had prohibited new storage tanks, didn't actually prohibit explicitly rail unloading stations, and also the policy wasn't in effect because it had been going through this legal challenge, and the remand process that Nick has mentioned hasn't happened yet. So kind of in the middle of this lapse of this law around new fossil fuel infrastructure, and the fact that a previous owner had actually submitted plans for this expansion. So in 2014, a previous owner submits plans to the city and gets approval to quadruple the rail unloading capacity. Doesn't do anything with their permits. In 2017, a new company buys the terminal, starts exporting tar sands, and then starts construction and acting on these old permits. And even though there was a change of ownership, that did not legally constitute a change in facility or be enough to trigger re-permitting or review of the facility. Just going to talk briefly.
If the law were in place, it's still not, because they're not storing, they're just unloading, it would still be allowed. Is that?
Because they're using the old storage tanks, not building new ones.
They are storing there. They just
Yeah.
had the infrastructure.
Yeah, they already had capacity to store 1.5 million barrels of oil, which is a huge, huge amount.
Is most of our storage oil, or is there also coal?
Yeah, so of the 11 terminals, 10 of that, most of them are actually storing the petroleum products for the state of Oregon. 95% of the transportation fuel for Oregon and Southwest Washington is stored there, and 100% of the jet fuel that comes to the Port of Portland passes through those storage tanks. And Northwest Natural also has a storage terminal where they have natural gas stored. But what's making Zenith really different is that all of these other facilities are really embedded and rooted in that regional market. And we have all of these other policies to work on transitioning that regional demand off of fossil fuels to renewable energy. And what Zenith is coming in is doing is they are engaging in the international fossil fuel economy. So tar sands is known as the dirtiest, most polluting form of fossil fuels. To extract the tar sands, they clear-cut the boreal forest in Canada and engage in a very, very complicated process of digging up the ground, and it's a very complicated refining process that happens in Canada to take this disgusting sludge in the ground and turn it into something that resembles crude oil. In Canada, they're loaded onto trains, and those trains are then traveling kind of along this route that you see on the far right, kind of down south into the United States, through Montana and Idaho, through the Columbia Gorge, through Vancouver, Washington, and into Portland. That is the most likely route that these trains are taking, but there are lots of other oil train lines that trains could pass on. And unfortunately, right now, Zenith is not the only source for an increase in oil trains. There's actually a broader increase in crude oil by rail happening in the Pacific Northwest and around the country. And so lots of people are seeing crude oil trains in Southeast Portland and Milwaukee at the Brooklyn Rail Yard. And some of those trains are going to other places. They're going south to Eugene. They're not going to Zenith. For Zenith, however, trains then are stored in a rail yard that's adjacent to the facility. So if you're in Northwest Portland and you want to go down there, you can actually drive by and see this rail yard that often has hundreds of oil cars parked in it waiting to be unloaded. When they get to Zenith, depending on the specific type of tar sands crude they have, because they do bring in multiple kinds, the cars are, some of them are steam heated for 12 hours to enable the tar sands to be viscous enough to be pumped into the tanks. Others already have a diluent added to make it able to flow. The trains that already have diluent added are more toxic if they have a derailment or other accident along the way. This is a marine tanker. It's actually a picture taken in Portland in March of 2018. Zenith does not have its own dock. It uses the neighboring Chevron facility's dock, and so Zenith actually has its own pipe that kind of goes through and connects via Chevron to their dock, where they can then load tankers that then travel down the Willamette and Columbia rivers out to the ocean. This specific boat was engaged in an export. We tracked it all the way. We've documented Zenith exporting crude to China, South Korea, and Japan, and they also are loading tar sands onto tankers that are then being shipped to Martinez, California, and to other refineries along the West Coast. And so I think it's really interesting that what we're seeing is Portland passing laws to restrict fossil fuel development, and we're seeing proposals for other tar sands and crude oil pipelines and projects being defeated across the country and in Canada, and the industry is getting more desperate to figure out ways to get their product out of the ground and to market. And so old oil terminals, old asphalt terminals are becoming more desirable to the industry because that's the only foothold they can get, because you can't build a new oil terminal in Portland. The only way you can do it is by finding an existing facility. And we're seeing that facilities that don't have the infrastructure needed to engage in large exports or kind of large fossil fuel transports are working together to compile the infrastructure they need. And so here we have Zenith and Chevron are explicitly working together, and there's some concerns that Zenith and McCall Oil, which is the other neighboring terminal, could start working together as well. And we don't have good laws and good regulations to look at these relationships and to look at cumulative emissions or cumulative environmental impact. Our laws look at these things very piecemeal and very separately, and so there's potential for large terminals, such as what's happening here in Portland, to be cobbled together with smaller existing infrastructure. These are just some key takeaways about Zenith. It's a new company using old permits. There is a lack of information both given to our regulators and to the general public right now about what Zenith is doing, and we've tracked them bringing in multiple different products and sending it to different locations in the year and a half they've been operating. But we do know that fossil fuels pose inherent risks to health and safety, and we know that we have to be dramatically reducing fossil fuel use to reduce our carbon emissions to address climate change. So really we know that we don't want tar sands in Portland or really anywhere, and that we have to keep them in the ground. So as we fight this specific project, we also need to be fighting tar sands and crude oil projects and development happening everywhere.
Yeah, and David might be able to speak more to this, but the United States is now by far the number one oil and gas producer in the world, and so we've seen a lot of sort of talk about domestic policy in order to transition our energy use to 100% renewables and things like that. But this export issue is remarkable. It's really important because a lot of economic and energy growth in the world is not happening necessarily in the United States, it's happening abroad. And so the more of this fuel, the more markets there are for this fuel to get to, the more destinations there are, the more that we can expect oil, gas, coal extraction and export. And so it might not be combusted within the United States, and we may not account for it on our domestic accounting, but it's still being burned and it's still driving climate change. So that's one of the reasons why we picked export projects to work on as well.
Maybe just to say, I mean, the timeline that you talk about, there's a critical piece of that, which is in the end of 2015, the elimination of the crude oil export ban, which was a federal policy barring export of crude oil. It had to be refined to some extent before it was exported abroad. And so the timing that you talk about with respect to this terminal fits that completely in terms of, okay, they got that elimination of the crude oil export ban, and all of a sudden you see a massive increase in exports, and you need places like here to do it. And we're talking about going from close to zero exports to 4 million barrels a day of exports of oil, of crude oil.
Yeah, and so the logic of our type of work is that if there's not the export infrastructure to transload, to store and transload this onto ships that then move it to other places for refinement and export, it doesn't have a place to go, right? There is a set place in the life cycle of fossil fuels for us to stop these projects, and then that's going to restrict the extraction.
Yeah.
So the last thing we wanted to talk about is another policy, a new policy that we're working on right now with Multnomah County, which is called fossil fuel risk bonds. And,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And this is intended to get toward what we would call the managed decline of existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So not only do we have to stop the new stuff, but we've got to start transitioning away from what's currently there. So some of that, we mentioned with renewable energy, the development of renewable energy hopefully will shift the market for supply of electricity really quickly away from fossil fuel energy, and that maybe more public transportation and more electric cars and more streetcars and more active transportation will reduce the demand for fossil fuels for our transportation network, so we'll move away from that as well. But as this industry starts to recede, one danger, first of all, we've got to do it faster than it will happen, let's say it's like natural market pace, so that's we need to nudge the market in the direction we want it to go. And then also there are dangers that are presently unaccounted for by the institutions themselves, and we as the public take those on as externalities. And there's a danger that the fossil fuel industry, with competition from renewables and other things, will end very quickly, and we'll be left with the bag on all of these polluted and damaged areas in our communities with basically no money in order to remediate and repair them for public use. So one way that we can think about a managed decline is to figure out ways of shifting those costs that right now the public bears back onto those industries. And fossil fuel risk bonds is a theory to try that.
Yeah, and so here, I'm actually just going to go back to this really quickly. And so generally, fossil fuel risk bonds can be broken up into two categories. The first is looking at conventional financial insurance mechanisms, bonds, things that already exist, and looking at how can those be maximized and applied to the fullest extent. An example of that would be sometimes a worst case scenario will need to be bonded for, but they'll assess that at 15% of a train derailing. And so this might say, actually the worst case scenario is 100% of the train derail. So you will expand the conventional insurance mechanism to include, a broader definition of worst case disaster. And then that second approach is a surcharge that would actually start to look at the local climate impacts of fossil fuels and the cost of adaptation and start to assess it. And so, we're really looking at both the kind of acute impacts, so a train derails, there's a leak, there's an explosion, but also looking at the cumulative environmental impact, so what is just the overall contamination that has happened to this area from decades and decades of business, and looking at the real risk of abandoned infrastructure or stranded assets, because we know that we are working on transitioning off of these fossil fuels. We have a timeline to end them. So I think one of the really exciting things to me about the fossil fuel risk bond program and the potential is it can function sort of like a security deposit would for a renter, and to say these companies are only getting back the money they post once they have closed down their terminal, cleaned up all the historic pollution, and remediated it so it can be used for something else to benefit the public good. Because, we're sort of visioning the year 2050, we have the renewable energy capacity to meet all of our energy needs. We don't need these fossil fuel terminals anymore. And we really want to see the companies themselves paying for the close down and cleanup of these terminals.
And just one other exciting piece around this is that we've started to, with Sunrise Movement, which is young people that have activated themselves around climate, and other climate justice organizations in the Portland area, started to really advance the narrative around a managed decline of fossil fuel infrastructure. And recently, the mayor of Portland, we're not sure that he understands the significance of what he said yet, but in a public meeting, was it just last Wednesday, in City Council, told a group of people that showed up to council in public on the record that he agrees with the idea of a managed decline of fossil fuel infrastructure, that we should have a community-wide plan to determine our timelines for dismantling the fossil fuel infrastructure, and also a community-led process for determining what we will use our formerly polluted industrial lands for in the public benefit moving forward. So again, he may not understand the significance of that yet, but from an advocacy side, that's great, right? That's another sort of alley-oop to us as organizers to go out and raise that issue, to think about how we might want that process to go, and much in line with a lot of the work that we've been doing. When we start a new campaign, it's almost always people see it as laughable and undoable and treat us like we're morons for even assessing and thinking that we could do those things. And we've got a demonstrated record of success of taking something that's kind of unthinkable, breathing some life and energy into it, and then coming through with a policy victory, all the while thinking about the global sort of dynamic here, where we've got to reduce fossil fuel use and carbon emissions, and we've got to do it at an extremely rapid pace. And so our work, we try to align it really closely with social movements and also decision makers at the local level to try to move that forward as far as possible. And then our secondary job is to communicate those lessons of success to our partners throughout the country and throughout the globe, in hopes that they'll adopt similar policies or will be inspired and have some kind of a take on that they're doing the same thing. And collectively, we're doing system change and not worrying as much around sort of the individual consumption side of things.
Yeah, and so Multnomah County, who has more authority to regulate on health and safety, is really excited about the fossil fuel risk bond approach, and they actually, in their last budget cycle, just allocated money to do a phase 1 fossil fuel risk assessment to start to look at what are the risks of our existing fossil fuel infrastructure, both the large infrastructure at the terminal hub, but also some of our smaller fossil fuel distributors, and also looking at rail lines and oil train derailment, and starting to put a dollar value on that. And the goal of this study is that it will make it so that Multnomah County could move forward, passing an ordinance to implement a fossil fuel risk bond program. And so they also will be studying the political feasibility and looking at what can they do to the fullest extent of their power, still within the law, to pass fossil fuel risk bonds. So that's really, really exciting that there's this traction and energy at Multnomah County moving forward with this.
Did you want to say something about Houston?
Sure. So we expect that fossil fuel risk bonds, if we can test it and start to work out some of the initial kinks, let's say, with the program, is something that could be transferable to most local governments, because it's mostly about fiduciary responsibility of local governments to protect residents and taxpayers from unnecessary burdens and costs. And there are some communities that are full on in what you call sacrifice zone mode, and Houston, Texas is one of those, where the fossil fuel industry is totally dominant. So they're driving climate change, but also when hurricanes like Harvey hit, you have these enormous disasters related to the fossil fuel industry, and then always a political pressure to try to put those costs back on the taxpayers. So we've had some conversations with folks in Houston that are excited to see whether we can sort of pilot this program here for potential adoption there. And you can imagine that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of other communities that would be sites for that to be accepted as well. So the next couple of years here will be really critical in terms of like doing the risk assessments right, getting all the methodology correct, figuring out what we have the power to do in Oregon, which may not necessarily be the same as everywhere. Some places will have more or less local authority, but figuring out a generalized template on this that then other communities can look at and be inspired by and adopt. So we're really excited about that. And this falls, I guess, into a category of what you call like market-based regulation, so it's something that there are many ways of doing a managed decline, and I think we're supportive of like a broad toolkit. But this is one way that, with the existing logic of how local government works and how systems work and how risks are assessed and insured, we think that we can kind of push this into that existing superstructure, and it will have impacts of transitioning fossil fuel structure. So, and I guess just another sort of pitch for folks that are, interested in this at all, and for our interns, you'll be there anyway. But we've got a bunch of campaigns going on this summer, and very easy to get involved. The easiest way is just sort of like reproducing our template and sending a letter to the city council or Multnomah County. We have found that through years of advocacy, we have a pretty mature climate action community in Portland, but we always need to grow and add people to it. And ideally, we would get to a stage where the climate action community wasn't like its own sort of insular thing, but that would just become an operating principle of how the community functions, right? That we would just, part of assessment of any policy or program is what kind of effects does it have on climate, what kind of effects does it have on local health and safety and air emissions, that instead of having to kind of like throw these as afterthoughts into policy, that those are the primary, it just becomes so common as to be assumed that we want a healthy community that's climate friendly. So we welcome involvement, and probably we're recruiting at other events over the summer as well. So feel free to bug us about more information of any of this, just technically, or how you can get involved. We'd be happy to figure it out.
And the 2 websites.
Yeah, so
just because I'm taping, it would be great if you could just say what they are.
Sure. So the Center for Sustainable Economy's website is sustainable-economy.org, and the Sustainable Energy Economy Network, which is a C4 organization, meaning they can do a little bit more political advocacy, is at seen.org. So we've got a little bit of time for questions if folks want to dive in and clarify anything.
Are there places where the risk bonds that people are starting, or where there's a little bit more advanced work on that, or is this sort of cutting edge right now?
We're not aware of any other communities where there are some state programs, for Washington, for example, that looks at certain categories of hazardous materials and assesses some kind of insurance and bonding requirements. Oregon also has less mature forms of that, less comprehensive forms of that. So there are examples in law of, let's say, similar programs, but nothing that we know of that's fossil fuel specific and comprehensive.
But that's actually what we're working on right now. We're working with.
I remember a year or two, or a couple of years ago, I guess, under the Obama administration, there's this whole issue of coal self-bonding, right, where basically they say, oh, we've got enough cash to deal with remediation or whatever else. And there was some work, I thought, done to fix that loophole to some extent. So basically when coal companies went bankrupt in Wyoming, they didn't leave the state on the hook. Mm-hmm. But I don't remember. I know that there was like at least some policy work done to fix that loophole. So I don't know.
Yeah, and part of the policy development, as it's been scoped in Multnomah County, is to do a gap analysis locally to figure out, from an individual facility to facility basis, what actual requirements there are, and to measure that up against the local assessment of what the worst case disaster scenario is, because the fossil fuel industry is unlikely to estimate it as high. And you'll know this, and maybe others do as well. There are, let's say, concurrent efforts happening with other advocacy organizations to try to put pressure on insurance companies directly to start taking a look at fossil fuel infrastructure related risks and climate risks, and start to actually require insurance from facilities to cover that. And we imagine, it's hard to know, I mean, it's going to differ on an individual basis, but we imagine as climate change continues to intensify and as the riskier fuels are coming to market in riskier ways, that those risks are going to continue to climb up to a point where you might see insurance companies just bailing from this industry together. And if we have requirements that you have to get insurance to cover a certain amount and then they can't be covered anymore, then, well, guess what? You can't do business anymore. So there's a variety of market pressures that are being asserted here. Ideally, you see massive safety upgrades in the short term, right? So that their costs of bonding go down and that we're all a little bit safer on a day-to-day basis. But the long-term goal is the transition away from the fossil fuel industry entirely.
Yeah.
Medium term, let's say.
Right now, the oil train safety bill being discussed in the Oregon legislature, HB 2209, includes a bonding for a worst-case scenario train derailment, but they're looking at that and defining it as 15% of the train derails. And so I think one of the things that my kind of review has seen is that a lot of the existing policies are inadequate at actually assessing the full risks. And so, as Nick was saying, part of what the kind of the study, the risk assessment component before putting in place a risk bonding program is to sort of figure out where are these gaps and what would a local jurisdiction step in and kind of piece together the rest of the coverage that doesn't already exist.
And likely it's stuff that will also see lawsuits anytime that there's any local, state, or federal regulation of the fossil fuel industry. There are lawsuits, and they have near endless pockets to sue anybody whenever they want to. And so groups like CSE that intervene in these types of lawsuits are really important in terms of like protecting that area of public advocacy and local advocacy on these issues. So
Thank you.
does somebody need to get into it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you all for listening.